The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Konarak, sent the sum phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Konarak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend he felt deeply rejected by. He would approach them in public places pretending to be injured or in need of help. Sometimes he wore a sling or used crutches. When kind strangers offered assistance, he would lead them to a secluded area and attack. His earliest confirmed victims were in Washington state. In 1974, a series of disappearances began to alarm police. Women vanished from college campuses, leaving little trace. One of the first was Linda, an Healy, a student at the University of Washington, who disappeared from her home in January 1974. That summer, two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described a handsome man with a cast on his arm asking women to help him load a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. This was one of the first times investigators had a name. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive allowed him to evade suspicion. He continued his studies, even attending law school. Outwardly, he dated women, maintained friendships, and volunteered in politics. Yet beneath this mask, his killings escalated. He abducted, raped, and murdered women across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His method was consistent. He lured victims, often at night, assaulted them, and killed them usually by strangulation or bludgeoning. He sometimes revisited the bodies, leaving them in remote wooded areas, and in some cases committing acts of necrophilia. By 1975, Bundy had moved to Utah, and killings began there as well. Local investigators grew alarmed at the pattern. He was eventually arrested that year after police found burglary tools in his car, which also contained suspicious items like handcuffs and a ski mask. At the time, this evidence was not enough for a murder charge, but it marked the beginning of his downfall. Bundy managed to escape custody multiple times, which only added to his infamy. In 1977, while held in Colorado, he leapt from a courthouse library window and fled. He was recaptured, but later that year, he escaped again from his jail cell by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling. He made his way across the country to Florida. In Florida, Bundy unleashed his most brutal attacks. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he attacked 4 women in their rooms, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring the others. Only weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. These crimes shocked the nation and ended any illusion that Bundy was a man who could restrain himself. His capture came soon after. In February 1978, he was pulled over by police in Pensacola driving a stolen car. Once identified, his face was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The trial that followed was the first to be televised, and millions watched as Bundy attempted to defend himself in court. He cross-examined witnesses and played the role of his own lawyer. His charm and arrogance fascinated the media, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis tied him to the Chi Omega murders, and witnesses placed him near the scenes. In 1979, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional trials followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he received another death sentence. Over the next decade, he lived on death row in Florida, appealing his case and granting interviews. During this time, he confessed to more than 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly over 100. Bundy described in chilling detail how he selected and killed his victims. In January 1989, his appeals ran out, and he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, the prison crowds gathered, chanting and celebrating the end of his life. For many families, the execution closed a painful chapter, though the scars of loss remained. The legacy of Ted Bundy endures because his crimes revealed how easily appearances can deceive. He was educated, articulate, and outwardly normal, yet beneath that facade lay a predator driven by compulsion. His case led to greater awareness of a need for coordinated police work across states, since Bundy moved freely between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young women who trusted a stranger in need. Today, Bundy is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for the way society responded to him. The media often portrayed him as charismatic, which drew criticism for humanizing him instead of focusing on the victims. Books, documentaries, and films continue to analyze his life, but at the core remain the stories of the women whose lives were stolen. They were daughters, sisters, and friends who deserve remembrance beyond the shadow of the man who killed them. Bundy's story is one of deception, manipulation, and cruelty wrapped in the mask of normalcy. It endures as a warning that evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Story 3. John Wayne Gacy was born in March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class family with a father who was an alcoholic and physically abusive. His childhood was marked by fear and insecurity. Though he tried to please his father, nothing ever seemed enough. He suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his activities. These early years shaped a man who longed for acceptance, but carried deep resentment and anger inside. Despite a difficult home life, Gacy worked hard to present himself as normal. In high school, he was not particularly athletic, but he participated in clubs and worked odd jobs. He developed an early interest in politics and community activities. After leaving school, he married and tried to build a stable life. For a time, he seemed successful. He managed several fast food restaurants and became involved in local organizations. His outward personality was friendly and generous. He hosted neighborhood gatherings and was known to dress as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and community events. This image of the cheerful neighbor and community volunteer would later stand in sharp contrast to the darkness he hid. Beneath the mask of normalcy, Gacy was leading a double life. He had already faced accusations of assaulting young men in the 1960s while living in Iowa. He was convicted of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 1968 and sentenced to prison. Though he served less than 2 years, he returned to Chicago with a record that should have been a warning. Instead, he managed to rebuild his reputation. He remarried, started his own construction business, and became active in local politics. He was even photographed with prominent politicians. To the public, he was a respected businessman. To those closest to him, there were glimpses of volatility, but few suspected the horror that lay hidden. Gacy's crimes escalated in the early 1970s. He lured young men and boys to his home, often offering them work construction jobs or simply a safe place to hang out. Once inside his modest suburban house, he would overpower them. His method became ritualistic. He used handcuffs, sometimes presenting them as a party trick. After restraining his victims, he would assault, torture, and eventually strangle them. Most of the killings took place in his home while his neighbors remained unaware. The number of victims grew over the years. Gacy buried many of them in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. The smell in the house became overwhelming at times, but Gacy explained it away as plumbing issues. He continued to maintain his outward image of normality, attending parties, working in politics, and performing as Pogo the Clown. The juxtaposition between his community role and his secret life made the eventual revelation all the more shocking. In 1978, his crimes began to unravel. That December, a teenage boy named Robert Pius disappeared after telling friends he was going to meet a contractor about a job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating, they quickly connected Gacy to other missing young men. They obtained a search warrant and entered his house. Inside, they found items that belonged to several missing victims. The stench from the crawl space raised immediate suspicions. A second search warrant allowed police to dig beneath the house. What they uncovered was a nightmare. Body after body was exhumed from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were buried there, with additional remains found in rivers nearby. Many of the victims were teenagers or young men who had simply vanished without explanation. For families who had searched desperately for answers, the discovery was devastating. Gacy was arrested and interrogated. His demeanor shocked investigators. He confessed calmly to more than 30 murders, describing his methods in chilling detail. He admitted that he had sometimes killed 2 victims in a single night. He spoke of the killings as though they were routine parts of his life. His lack of remorse and the sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned detectives. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in 1980. It attracted enormous attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence of his double life and the brutality of his murders. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury was unconvinced. The calculated nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain a normal outward life demonstrated that he understood his actions. After only a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 33 counts of murder. It was one of the largest conviction totals for a single person in American history at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them depicting clowns. These paintings were sometimes sold at auctions, sparking controversy. Gacy gave interviews in which he denied responsibility despite his earlier confessions. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. His shifting stories only added to his notoriety. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside, the prison crowds gathered in celebration. For many families, the execution brought some closure, though nothing could restore the lives that were lost. The sheer scale of his crimes left a permanent scar on the communities he had haunted. The case of John Wayne Gacy continues to resonate because of the contrast between his public and private lives. He was the friendly neighbor, the businessman, the clown who entertained children, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator who murdered more than 30 young men. His ability to hide in plain sight exposed flaws in the system and highlighted how vulnerable runaway teens and young workers were in the 1970s. The legacy of Gacy is one of horror and deception. His crimes serve as a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that predators can exist even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The memory of his victims endures as a testament to lives cut short by a man who wore a mask, both literal and figurative. Behind the smile of a clown lay the heart of a killer. Story 4. The Zodiac Killer is a name that still casts a shadow over the history of American crime. Active in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California, the Zodiac terrorized communities with brutal murders and cryptic letters. Unlike many other killers, his identity was never confirmed, which has only deepened the mystery and fear surrounding the case. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, near the small town of Benicia, California. Two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on their first date when they parked at a lover's lane spot. A car pulled up beside them. The assailant forced them out and shot both of them with a handgun. Betty Lou died instantly, and David was mortally wounded. There was no robbery or clear motive. It seemed a senseless act. Investigators had few leads, and the case went cold. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned and opened fire with a handgun. Darlene was killed, and Mike survived with serious injuries. Just over an hour later, a man called the Vallejo police station claiming responsibility not only for this attack, but also for the previous one on David and Betty Lou. The caller provided details that had not been released publicly. It was the first direct communication from the man who would call himself the Zodiac. Weeks later, newspapers received letters written by the killer. These letters were taunting, filled with strange symbols and coded messages. In one, he introduced himself with the chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that the letters be published or he would kill more people. Inside the letters were cryptograms that he claimed revealed his identity. One of the first ciphers was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not reveal a name, but instead a disturbing message where the killer declared that he enjoyed killing because it was fun. The Zodiac struck again on September 27th, 1969 at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by the water when a man approached wearing a hood with a crosshair symbol on the chest. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died. Before leaving the scene, the attacker scrawled a message on the victim's car door with the dates of his previous attacks and his distinctive crosshair symbol. Only 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. He shot him in the head and then bizarrely cut a piece of the victim's shirt to send later with a letter. Witnesses saw the killer at the scene, describing him as a white male in his 30s with glasses. Despite this near miss, the Zodiac managed to escape into the night. Police rushed to the area, but confusion about the suspect's race led officers to let him walk past them. This mistake may have cost them their best chance at capture. Over the following years, the Zodiac continued to send letters to newspapers and police. In them, he mocked investigators, boasted about his crimes, and threatened mass killings. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only a handful have been definitively linked to him. The letters often included ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His messages revealed a man who craved attention and control more than anything. He wanted to be feared and to prove that he was smarter than the authorities. The investigation into the Zodiac was massive. Police departments across multiple counties worked together, but cooperation was strained at times. Thousands of tips poured in and hundreds of suspects were investigated. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo and matched some descriptions. He was interviewed multiple times and even named in a search warrant. Circumstantial evidence pointed toward him, but definitive proof never surfaced. DNA analysis years later did not match him, though doubts and debates remain. As time passed, the Zodiac's letters grew less frequent. His last confirmed correspondence was in 1974. After that, the trail went cold. Some believe he died or was imprisoned for another crime. Others think he simply stopped writing and continued living quietly under a false identity. The lack of closure left victims' families and investigators frustrated. In the decades since the killings, the Zodiac has become part of American folklore. Books, documentaries, and films have kept the story alive. Amateur sleuths have dedicated their lives to decoding his ciphers and piecing together clues. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved one of his unsolved ciphers sent in 1969. The message contained more taunts, but again, no name. This reinforced the idea that the Zodiac never intended to reveal his identity. His goal was to manipulate the public and instill fear. The impact of the Zodiac case was profound. It highlighted the challenges of interagency cooperation in the pre-digital era, when communication between counties was slow. It showed how media attention could both aid and hinder investigations. The constant publication of his letters gave him the spotlight he desired, but also kept the public informed. To this day, the identity of the Zodiac remains unproven. DNA analysis offers some hope, but the evidence is limited and degraded by time. Theories abound, ranging from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to more obscure figures. Every few years, a new claim emerges about his identity, but none have been confirmed. The story of the Zodiac killer endures because it combines brutal violence with mystery. Unlike other serial killers who were eventually caught and exposed, the Zodiac remains a ghost figure lurking in the shadows of history. His victims were ordinary people, young couples enjoying evenings by the water, or a cab driver working late at night. Their lives were cut short by a man who wanted to be remembered for terror rather than for who he was. Today, more than 50 years later, the case continues to fascinate because it is unfinished. The unanswered questions leave space for endless speculation. The Zodiac's cryptic symbols remain as haunting reminders of a killer who manipulated fear with both weapons and words. His legacy is not only in the murders he committed, but in the way he exploited mystery itself, turning crime into a dark puzzle that is yet to be solved. Story 5. Richard Ramirez was born in February 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability and violence. His father was strict and often abusive. His mother worked in a factory where exposure to chemicals may have affected her health. Richard grew up surrounded by poverty and dysfunction. From a young age, he was influenced by his older cousin Miguel, who had returned from serving in Vietnam. Miguel boasted about brutal acts he had committed during the war and even showed Richard disturbing photographs of women he claimed to have assaulted. At only 12 years old, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife during a domestic argument. These traumatic experiences left deep scars on the boy, who was already vulnerable. Richard began experimenting with drugs as a teenager, turning to marijuana and later LSD. He also developed a fascination with Satanism and dark rituals. He struggled in school and dropped out early. His petty crimes soon escalated into burglaries. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, drifting through Los Angeles and San Francisco, surviving on theft and immersing himself in a lifestyle of addiction and violence. His descent into murder began in 1984. That June, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her body showed signs of mutilation. Police had no suspect at the time, but years later this crime was linked to Richard Ramirez. It marked the start of his killing spree. By 1985, the murders escalated dramatically. Ramirez gained the nickname the Night Stalker because he attacked in the middle of the night. He targeted homes across Southern California, breaking in while victims slept. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife or blunt objects. He killed men and women of all ages. He assaulted women and sometimes children. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and forced victims to swear their loyalty to the devil. The randomness of his attacks created widespread fear because nobody knew who might be next. In March 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead. She survived by raising her hands and deflecting a bullet. Minutes later, he killed another woman, Tsai, leaving you outside her car nearby. That same evening, he killed a third woman in her apartment. These rapid attacks terrified the city. Newspapers began covering the Night Stalker daily. Over the next months, Ramirez continued his spree. He invaded homes across Los Angeles and beyond, often leaving survivors who could describe his appearance. He was tall, thin, with rotting teeth and a foul odor that witnesses never forgot. His brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In some cases, he forced couples to witness each other's assaults before killing one or both. He showed no consistent pattern except his desire to terrorize. The police struggled to catch him. At first, the crime seemed unrelated because of the varying weapons and methods. But soon detectives connected the attacks by shoe prints left behind. A distinct sneaker pattern linked multiple scenes. The media reported on this detail, which angered investigators because Ramirez could have changed his shoes to avoid detection. Still, the clue remained vital. By the summer of 1985, his crimes reached a peak. He attacked in San Francisco, killing Peter and Barbara Pan in their home. The mayor of San Francisco publicly revealed that the killer used a .22 caliber handgun. Ramirez read the papers constantly and adjusted his tactics to confuse police. But mistakes piled up. Survivors gave detailed descriptions, and eventually a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen car he abandoned. Police matched it to Richard Ramirez, who already had a record for theft and drug charges. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was finally captured, but not by police at first. His photograph had been released to the public, and when he attempted to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized. Neighbors chased him through the streets and cornered him. The crowd beat him until police arrived to take him into custody. The capture brought relief to a city that had been living in fear for months. The trial of Richard Ramirez became one of the most notorious in American history. It began in 1989 and lasted over a year. The courtroom was often filled with reporters and curious spectators. Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. He flashed satanic hand signs and shouted "Hail Satan" during proceedings. His gaunt appearance, dark eyes, and defiant attitude made him a figure of morbid fascination. Despite his behavior, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified in detail. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and ballistic matches, tied him to multiple murders. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, as well as numerous counts of assault, burglary, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin prison. Outside, the courthouse crowds cheered the verdict. Families of victims wept both in grief and in relief that justice had been served. On death row, Ramirez continued to attract media attention. He received letters from admirers and even married a woman who believed in his innocence. His presence remained unsettling. Unlike some killers who eventually expressed remorse, he showed none. He continued to speak about Satanism and portrayed himself as an outcast who had embraced evil. Ramirez never faced execution. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades. In June 2013, he died of complications related to cancer at the age of 53. For some, the fact that he died of natural causes rather than execution was frustrating, but his death finally closed the chapter on his life. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains one of pure terror. His crimes were random, cruel, and driven not by need, but by desire to spread fear. Unlike killers who targeted specific types of victims, Ramirez attacked anyone he encountered. This unpredictability magnified the panic in California communities. People began locking doors, installing new security systems, and staying awake at night terrified that he might strike. His story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary homes and the way one man can paralyze entire cities. The survivors of his attacks continue to carry the memories of those nights. The families of the dead live with the loss of loved ones whose lives were cut short in acts of senseless brutality. Richard Ramirez remains a reminder of the darkest extremes of human behavior. He called himself a servant of Satan, but in reality, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His name and the moniker Night Stalker endure in American memory as symbols of fear that once gripped a generation. Story 6. In the quiet rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, during the first half of the 20th century, life moved slowly and simply. The community was small, neighbors knew one another, and farms stretched across the flat landscape. Yet behind this peaceful setting there lived a man whose crimes would eventually horrify the entire nation. His name was Edward Theodore Gain. Ed Gain was born in August 1906 to George and Augusta Gain. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to hold steady work, while his mother was deeply religious, domineering, and strict. Augusta instilled in her two sons a belief that the world was filled with sin and corruption. She particularly warned them against women, describing them as instruments of immorality. Ed grew up isolated. The family rarely allowed social interaction, and the Gain children were discouraged from making friends. As a child, Ed was shy, quiet, and awkward. He was ridiculed by other children at school, which only pushed him further into isolation. His mother's teachings shaped him profoundly. He developed an unhealthy attachment to Augusta, viewing her as the only pure and trustworthy person in the world. This dependence would define his entire life. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving the family to survive on farm income. Soon after, his older brother Henry began expressing doubts about their mother's strict worldview. Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy devotion to Augusta, but in 1944 Henry died in a suspicious fire while working on the family property. Although the official cause was listed as asphyxiation, investigators quietly noted that the circumstances were odd. Ed reported the fire, and when Henry's body was found, it appeared not badly burned, leading some to wonder if Ed had played a role in his brother's death. After Henry's passing, Ed was left alone with his mother. But only a year later, in 1945, Augusta herself died following a series of strokes. Her death devastated Ed. He had lost the one person who dominated his world and provided structure to his life. Without her guidance, he became reclusive, retreating into the farmhouse that grew increasingly filthy and cluttered. Most rooms were left untouched as shrines to Augusta, kept exactly as she had left them, while Ed confined himself to a few areas filled with debris and decay. It was in this lonely environment that Ed's obsession with death and the human body began to take its most disturbing form. He frequently visited cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried bodies. He removed skin, bones, and organs, taking them back to his farmhouse where he fashioned grotesque trophies. Investigators later discovered masks made of human skin, bowls crafted from skulls, and furniture upholstered with human hides. These creations suggested that Ed was attempting to recreate his mother's presence or even become her by wearing the skin of women he exhumed. For many years, his macabre activities went unnoticed. Plainfield was a small, trusting community, and Ed was seen as odd but harmless. He worked odd jobs, babysat for neighbors, and was known for being polite though strange. That perception changed in November 1957 when Bernice Wardens, the local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her store was found locked with bloodstains on the floor. A receipt showed that Ed Gain had been her last customer that day. Police obtained a search warrant and went to Ed's farmhouse. What they found shocked even the most experienced officers. Inside the house were the remains of Bernice Wardens. Her body had been hung in a shed and gutted like a deer. As investigators searched further, They uncovered the horrific collection of human remains Ed had gathered over the years. Masks of human faces hung on the walls. Chairs were covered in human skin, and boxes contained organs. Some remains were traced back to missing women, though Ed admitted many came from graves he had robbed. The discoveries horrified the public. The idea that a quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor had been committing such grotesque acts shattered the sense of safety in small-town America. Newspapers across the country printed the details, and Ed Gein quickly became infamous. His crimes went beyond murder into a realm of depravity rarely seen. During interrogation, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, tavern owner Mary Hogan, who had vanished in 1954. He also admitted to robbing graves, but claimed he had not killed most of the women whose remains were found in his house. His statements revealed a disturbed mind. He described entering trances when digging up bodies, and he explained how he crafted clothing and masks in an effort to transform himself into his mother. In 1958, Ed Gein was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric institution. For more than a decade, he remained there until doctors declared him fit for trial. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was found guilty but insane, leading to his return to a mental hospital where he spent the remainder of his life. He died in 1984 at the age of 77. The case of Ed Gein left a lasting legacy not only in true crime history, but also in popular culture. His crimes inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. His story raised questions about mental illness, isolation, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. For the people of Plainfield, the scars never fully healed. The town became associated with darkness it never asked for. Many locals avoided speaking about Ed Gein for decades, wishing to move past the horror. Yet the farmhouse where he committed his crimes became a site of morbid curiosity until it was eventually burned down. Ed Gein remains a figure of fascination because his crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare. He was not the typical killer driven by greed or impulse. Instead, he was a man shaped by isolation, dominated by his mother, and consumed by fantasies that grew more grotesque after her death. His actions shocked a nation because they revealed what can emerge from loneliness and obsession left unchecked. Even today, his story is studied in criminal psychology as an example of how trauma, control, and mental illness can twist a life into something almost unimaginable. Behind every horror film inspired by his deeds is the reminder that these terrors were once real in a small Wisconsin town where people thought they knew their neighbors.